Today we're going to be talking about nutrient cycling. And if you recall in a video we made previously on matter, we said that matter is recycled over and over and over. In fact, if you count all the atoms on Earth today and compare it to the number of atoms on Earth 4.6 billion years ago, it's about the same amount. All that's happened is these atoms have come together to form molecules. They've broken apart, come together to form new, different types of molecules, broken apart again, and this process has occurred over and over and over. This process is referred to as nutrient cycling. And in order for this to occur, we need the help of living organisms and also physical processes such as lightning. Now, every single organism on Earth needs its nutrients in a particular form. So nutrient cycling is extremely important. Well, let's go ahead and see how the nitrogen cycle is required by living organisms. So let's go ahead and write down the nitrogen cycle. And we'll start with molecular nitrogen, N2. And a lot of molecular nitrogen can be found in the air. In fact, about 78% of the air is molecular nitrogen. Now, molecular nitrogen is bonded to itself via a triple covalent bond, a very, very stable molecule. In fact, this is so stable that many organisms can't utilize molecular nitrogen as a source of nitrogen. However, a few types of organisms can. They can actually convert this nitrogen in the atmosphere to ammonia, NH3, through a process called nitrogen fixation. And one of the types of bacteria that can do this is cyanobacteria. Now remember, air is considered to be a major reservoir or pool for nitrogen. That means it's a major location where nitrogen can be found. So it's a major reservoir. Now, some organisms, well, actually, let's go back to this. Lightning is also important here. However, it's a small source of ammonia, but it can be used to convert nitrogen into ammonia. And then some ammonia is converted to nitrogen oxides, NOx. And there are two big types of nitrogen oxides, NO2, which are nitrites, and NO3, which are nitrates. In fact, nitrites and nitrates are the favorite form of nitrogen for plants. So let's write that down. Plants' favorite form. Now, this process is referred to as nitrification. Now, some of these nitrogen oxides are then converted back to molecular oxygen in the air through a process called denitrification. Some of these nitrogen oxides are also converted to proteins and nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, in plants through a process called assimilation. And then animals eat the plants, and they take the proteins in plants and the nucleic acids in plants, and they convert them into their own proteins and their own nucleic acids. Now, when plants and animals die, those proteins, those nucleic acids get broken down into ammonia through a process called ammonification. In fact, when animals die, one of the reasons why animals tend to smell when they die is because those proteins are being converted to ammonia, which has a very strong odor. Now, before we leave the nitrogen cycle, I want to talk about one more process, extremely important process, called the Haber-Bosch process. This is an artificial process that converts molecular nitrogen into ammonia. This was developed for several reasons several decades ago, but one of the major reasons we use this process today is to make fertilizers. Fertilizers that are used to grow crops and support the population of 7 billion people. It turns out that if we didn't have this process, we wouldn't be able to make enough fertilizer and we wouldn't be able to grow enough food for everyone. So it's a very important process. However, it has its drawbacks too. A lot of this fertilizer doesn't get into the plants. It actually gets run off into rivers and streams and lakes and oceans, and it creates big problems. One of those problems is referred to as eutrophication. It turns out nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. That means it's normally found in short supply. And because of that, it limits the growth of certain populations, especially algae. If too much nitrogen is made available for algae, they begin to grow out of control and cause big problems. We'll talk about those later. That's the nitrogen cycle. Let's go ahead and talk about the carbon cycle next. So we're going to go ahead and draw the ground, soil, and the rocks, because there's a lot, especially sedimentary rocks, there's a lot of carbon stored in sedimentary rocks. In fact, rocks are a major reservoir of carbon. Also, the air can be considered to be a reservoir for carbon, a rather small one, but a significant one. It turns out that air contains carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is found at about 0.04% in air. So it's a very small amount. However, it's a greenhouse gas, and it's responsible for making our climate rather comfortable. Now, this carbon dioxide can be taken out of the air and put into living organisms through a process called photosynthesis. And eventually, when organisms die, or when organisms breathe, when they exhale, some of this carbon in their bodies is released back into the atmosphere in the form of CO2 through a process called cellular respiration. Now, for a long time, this was the way it was. These two processes, along with a little bit of erosion, released the carbon, and it was transformed into different forms. And then people came along, and we found a new source of carbon. And that source was called fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are coal, oil, and natural gas. Now be careful, natural gas is not the same thing as gasoline. In fact, it's totally different. Natural gas is methane, CH4. And we started burning these fossil fuels. Now remember, these fossil fuels were locked up deep underground for tens and hundreds of millions of years in a form that was very safe. And we started taking these fossil fuels and burning larger and larger quantities of them, especially since the Industrial Revolution, in a process called combustion. And when we combust fossil fuels, we convert it from a very safe form into carbon dioxide. And by adding carbon dioxide to what's already in the air, we're creating more greenhouse gases. And in fact, we're actually warming the Earth up above what it should be, above what's comfortable for most organisms. And that's a topic for another video. Now that's the carbon cycle. Let's go ahead and talk about the water cycle next. The water cycle, or hydrologic cycle. I'm going to go ahead and draw the ground again. And a lot of water. In fact, the major reservoirs for water are oceans, fact, oceans account for 97% of all the water on Earth. It's in the form of salt water, which isn't usable by most organisms. There is glaciers. There are groundwater. And then rivers, streams, and lakes. It turns out these two sources right here, groundwater, rivers, streams, and lakes, are is the water that actually is available to us most of the time. And it accounts for less than 1% of the water on Earth. Because glaciers, the water is all frozen, not a very available resource for us. Less than 1%. Now we've got to be careful here, because less than 1%, and then we take that less than 1% of water and we pollute it, or we use it in inefficient means for irrigating crops and things like that. We've got to be very careful with that 1% and treat it with respect. Now, let's go ahead and draw some clouds here. And there is water in the atmosphere. And this water rains down on Earth through a process called precipitation. Now, some of that water infiltrates into the ground and is stored as groundwater. Other flows off as rivers and streams and into oceans. Eventually, a lot of the water makes its way back into the atmosphere through the process of evaporation. And these are the major processes by which water is cycled around the environment. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the phosphorus cycle. I'm going to go ahead and draw the ground with a hill, because a lot of phosphorus is found in rocks. So rocks are going to be the major reservoir for phosphorus. And that phosphorus gets released through erosion. Normally a very slow process. And because of that, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient, along with nitrogen. It is a limiting nutrient, and it normally holds back the growth of organisms, the excessive growth of organisms. If we put too much phosphorus into the environment through fertilizers or other means, detergents maybe, then we create excessive growth of certain types of organisms, especially algae, leading to problems. Now, organisms also need phosphorus. We do need small amounts of phosphorus to make proteins and also nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And when living organisms die, that phosphorus is released back into the ground via decomposition. And that is the phosphorus cycle. Let's go ahead and talk about the sulfur cycle. Again, we're going to go ahead and draw a little hill there. And a lot of sulfur can be found in rocks. So rocks are going to be a major reservoir for sulfur. And again, that sulfur is released through erosion. And living organisms need sulfur in order to make their proteins. And then when living organisms die, that sulfur is released back into the ground again through decomposition. Now it turns out that there is also something called volcanoes. And when volcanoes erupt, they can release a lot of sulfur into the atmosphere in the form of sulfur dioxide. However, we don't have huge volcanic eruptions every single year in the world. So this amount of sulfur tends to be relatively low, although it does occur. One of the biggest places in which sulfur is moved from one place to another is through a human-induced means. In fact, coal-fired power plants coal-fired power plants. Coal is a very dirty rock. It contains a lot of sulfur, mercury, arsenic, lead, radioactivity. It's got all kinds of impurities in it. And when you burn massive quantities of coal all around the world, those impurities go up into the atmosphere. And one of those impurities is sulfur. And it produces sulfur dioxide, SO2. And when that sulfur dioxide combines with water, we get H2SO4, sulfuric acid. And that sulfuric acid rains back down to the ground again in the form of acid rain, which is causing big problems. If you've ever been to the Adirondacks in New York State and you've hiked up some mountains, a lot of the trees on the top of the mountains are dead. And if you look at the lakes, they look crystal clear. How beautiful. But that's because the water is dead. There's no algae, there's no bacteria, there's no living organisms in the water, and there should be. So these are big problems. Over half of the energy, over half of the electricity in the United States is produced through coal-fired power plants. It's a good source of energy because it's cheap, but it also has its drawbacks too. It's cheap, it's energy dense, but it causes a lot of pollution. We need to try to work on finding new energy sources so we can replace these coal-fired power plants. And that's it for nutrient cycling.